Okay, so let's talk quilt terms. We're only going to talk about beginning quilt terms today. They're the things that I wish I had known before I started, but hey, that's why I'm doing this, so that you don't go through the same things that I went through. Let's talk fabric first. You're going to need fabric, and when you're first starting out, some people might tell you to use precuts, which is just fabric that has already been cut into a shape. That way you can just sew it straight together. I don't know. I did not start with precuts for my very first project, and I'm okay with that. But if you don't want to get some scissors and the mat and the rotary cutter, and you just have a machine and you want to start going, you're still going to need scissors, but jump on in with precuts. So precuts have terms. This right here is a stack of, here we go, charm pack. This is a charm pack, and what that is 5-inch squares. Now this is where a lot of people will tell you to start. They'll say grab a pack of charms and go for it and just start sewing them together. The next one is a mini charm pack. These are 2.5 by 2.5 inch squares. They are, and they'll give you an entire line of fabric. So a designer will come out and with a line of fabric, and you will get at least one of each of their designs in your charm packs. The bigger ones, I have done an entire quilt with layer cakes. So this is a 10-inch by 10-inch square, again, called a layer cake. Now, you'll see these everywhere. You'll see these in the big box stores now, Joann's, Michael's. I don't know why I say big box, like I am sponsored by somebody and can't mention names. I can say whoever I want to on my channel. Joann's and Michael's. Joann certainly has these. This is called a jelly roll. Now, I believe jelly roll is specific to a brand. Like a brand has the market cornered on being able to say jelly roll. So some people might say, I think people say honey buns, but that might refer, anyway, let me just not confuse you. When you see this or you're looking for something, you can certainly say jelly roll and everybody will know what you're talking about. These are 2.5-inch strips by the width of fabric. So they're super long, 2.5-inch strips that are all rolled up super tightly in here. I might have a jelly roll strip in its full entirety right in front of us. Let's see. That is not in its entirety. Okay, here we go. This is a full jelly roll. So it was just wound up and then I popped it out, and this is what they look like. It's folded in half because that's how fabric comes on the bolts, and then you open it up and that's how long it is. You can usually get, I want to say about 42 inches off of the fabric bolt. Okay. So we've done charm packs, mini charm packs, layer cakes, jelly roll, fat quarters. Fat quarters are weird. They are bigger than the layer cake. And here is what a fat quarter looks like. This one here, they all come with the salvage on them. And this is called salvage. This is where the fabric is on the bolt, and that you'll see, I don't know if you can see it from there, but they're little itty bitty tiny holes. You're going to cut that off. Most people don't use that or keep that in your quilt. It's called the selvage, and you really don't, you're not trying to get that in your quilt. Some people do it, and some people save the selvages and then make things with them, but for the most part, you want to cut that off. And again, a fat quarter, if I were to do a quarter, and I don't want to get into all that, just fat quarters. I was going to try to explain fabric on when it comes off the bolt and why we call it a fat quarter, because you get more width, but we're not going to do that. We're just going to say that that is a fat quarter, and you'll usually see them in packs like this. This is a pack of fat quarters, and you'll get Usually if it's a line, you can get half of it, pieces of it, solids and fat quarters. But I just showed you that is a side of a fat quarter. So now I'm going to just start running through terms A to Z, not necessarily in any particular order, just as they come up. Applique. Applique is when you sew a shape of some sort onto the fabric. That is called appliquing. You are taking a shape. It can be done by hand, with a machine, with fusing, like fusible, and that's just the gluey stuff on the back, and you put it on your fabric and you sew it down. That's applique. You'll hear people say background fabric. So if you're looking at this little quilt behind me, the dark, that gray between the hearts, that would be considered my background fabric. So most times when you're doing a quilt that has a pattern, you'll probably need a bit more background fabric than the rest of the fabric. It's just the fabric that's going to go on the background. And usually you don't want it to be too overpowering, depending upon how your quilt design goes. Backing. Backing is going to be the back of your quilt. So this here is the backing fabric on, I think this is the first full-size quilt I made. Yeah, I think this is number 1. This is the backing fabric. It's got cartoon characters all over it. It looks like a comic book. So let me just say that a quilt is comprised of a sandwich. I am not following the order, but anyway, sandwich. So you've got your quilt top. So you sew a bunch of stuff together, and then you have the top of the quilt. Then you have the backing, the back of your quilt. But then in the middle, you have something called batting. B-A-T-T-I-N-G. This is quilt batting. This is 80-20. I want to say that's 80% cotton, 20% polyester. And it's the stuff that goes in the middle. And you can make this up to be, thicker, thinner. You just layer it up and whatnot. But that's what goes in the middle of a quilt. And then you have what they call a quilt sandwich. And the process of taking the needle through all the layers is called quilting. And that's where it gets super confusing. I realize that. You're thinking, is it making the top quilting? No, that's making the top. So you sew together the top, also known as piecing. I have just gone all away from the list, but anyway, you're going to sew this stuff together, and that's called piecing. So you're piecing your top, then you'll have your batting in the middle, then you'll have your backing, and then you got to make them all go together by sticking a needle through all your layers and back up, and all your layers and back up, and that's called quilting. I quilted this quilt in front of you, and you can probably see the blue straight lines. I love straight line quilting. It's all I really can do, but I think it's beautiful. But I don't find that I really like that process because my machine is not huge and I like to make big quilts. So I outsource my quilting to what they call a long armor. I'm going to insert a picture of a long arm machine for people who have never seen a long arm machine, because my favorite statement is you don't know until you know. And that is a huge sewing machine that you can put your big quilts on, that takes the needle through all the layers, and you can program it with designs. And then there are some people who are just amazingly talented, and they basically doodle and thread over your quilt, and that's quilting it. And that is called free motion quilting, when they are freely standing there making this big old machine dance all over your quilt. Some people do it to music, and I think that's really cool, but that is called quilting. So back to the list, we talked about backing, basting. To baste your quilt is to take your back, your middle, your top, and you're going to stick them all together before you quilt it. So I like to do my basting with pins. So I stick my pin through all the layers, usually about 4 inches apart. And then I take it to my machine and quilt it, stick the needle all the way through all the layers until you take out the pins as you're going along. And that's basting is you can do it with glue, you can do it with pins, and it holds all the layers in place so that you can actually quilt it. And that comes out, or if you're using glue, I mean, you're not going to take the glue out, but it's just to temporarily hold the quilt pieces together so that you can stick that quilt all the way through and quilt it. We talked about batting. Let's talk about bias. It's something that I kept hearing in my very beginning stages of quilting, and I just didn't get it. And even today, now I get it now. I've run into it, I've screwed up with it, blah, blah, blah. Quilt has a grain. There is, when you're looking at your fabric and you pull on it, it's going to be more stretchy on one side than it is on the other. So this is going to be the stretchy side. So in the front, you see the deer when they're facing up the way that you would want to see them. Not so stretchy, that grain right there, but right here, super stretchy, and you can distort your fabric. If you really want to see bias come out and play, where's the alpha? Watch. Blade out. I'm cutting this on a diagonal. I'm freehanding it. People always tell you to be careful and avoid stretching out your bias. So sometimes you will need to cut things on a diagonal angle, right? But what happens is it's super stretchy. Do you see that? Super stretchy, and it doesn't just go back. You keep pulling on this, and if you pull it too tight while you're sewing it, all of a sudden you have a distorted square. It can happen just like that. Some people try to combat it with a ton of starch, which helps. But you have to be careful when you're working on the bias. So that would be the angle bias. Super stretchy. Diagonal, this is the diagonal direction across the surface of the fabric at a 45-degree angle. It can get you. Binding. So we have our quilt, we have the top, we have the middle, we have the bottom, or the backing, and now we need to bind that sucker. So binding is when you cover the raw edges of your quilt. I don't have a quilt that's, no, I don't have any partially finished. That's not true. I don't have any, ha ha ha, yes I do. Oh, I basted this sucker though. Okay, so binding is when you, before you finish, you have to put on something on the border to cover up the raw edge. So we've taken our backing, our middle, our top, and then we've cut it so that we squared up our quilt so that it's as square as we can get it. And then we have the sandwich. It's just exposed, right? It's just the top, the middle, and the back, and it's just hanging out there. So to finish it, you have to do your binding. And that is this strip of fabric here that goes around. Now, most people sew it on one side, flip it over. I shouldn't say most. Some people sew it on one side, flip it over, then hand stitch it, which is very therapeutic and lovely. Some people attempt to machine stitch it, which I did. This is my very first quilt. If you judge me, we're not friends. And I decided to do a decorative stitch on there and and machine stitch it. Not my gift. This is a hot mess, but again, it was my very first quilt, but it's cool when you do it right. I've seen people who are just excellent at it. Go the people. All right, a border. Oh, so for my first quilt, I went for all the things. If I knew the word, I tried to do it on my quilt. So this quilt also has a border on it. And a border is just probably what you're thinking it is. It is a border on the quilt. So this one here has like a 4-inch border that just goes all the way around the quilt. Yes, do not be surprised. I put a flange on my very first quilt. A flange is this thing right here for the people who know quilting, who are probably not watching this video, but this little flap right here is a flange, and I like it. It gives it a little something. Okay, so that's border. You might run into something called English paper piecing. I just started English paper piecing literally 2 days ago, but it was literally the very first pattern that I bought. I didn't know what I was doing. I didn't know where I was going with this. So I've had that pattern sitting around for 2 years, and I'm just now getting into it. And I love it. I really, really, really enjoy English paper piecing. What that is it's a piece of paper. Actually, I'm going to do a whole video on that, but anyway, it's a piece of paper. You fold the fabric around the paper, glue it down, then sew those pieces of paper together, and then it makes a pattern, and it's cool. I like it. It's a hand, well, people do it with machine, but it's really a hand sewing art, and I'll talk about why I'm doing that. Blah, 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 but that's English paper piecing, and you might hear, you're going to hear it. You're going to see a pattern by, who is that, Elizabeth Hartman? You're going to see a pattern by her at some point. You're going to be like, I want to do that. And then you're going to find out that it's either English paper piecing or foundation paper piecing, which I guess I can explain to you. I actually have a small video of me doing some foundation piecing. And that's actually when you take a piece of paper, you sew the fabric to the paper, and then you take the paper out, and then you're left with really nice points. I have a quilt that I did that's foundation pieced, and the points just line up perfectly. I'm going to insert a picture of that over here. It's probably one of the most beautiful quilts I've ever done, and it was done by sewing the fabric to the paper and then ripping the paper out after you're finished. It's more to it than that, but English paper piecing is when you're going to fold and glue the paper down. Foundation piecing, you're gonna sew that sucker. I've done both, and I like both, but imagine that, a paper crafter who likes paper plus fabric. Quilting, it all makes sense. Okay. Something else you might hear, we talked about the fat quarter, finger pressing. That is when you sew a seam and take your finger and press it. Use it like an iron. You're going to use your finger like an iron, and that's called finger pressing. I have this thing here, which is by Violet Craft. You will probably see a pattern by her too that you want to do because she's awesome. I should pop up some patterns by Violet Craft and Elizabeth Hartman, whatever. This right here is, it's like a little, it's like you need to use an iron, but you're not going to use an iron, so you use this and you roll it back and forth on your seam, and it flattens it all out. Finger pressing, that little guy. I have another very pretty wood iron. I had no idea what this did, but I was at the quilt shop show, and I thought it was pretty, so I bought it because I'm a psycho, and it does the same thing. You run it, it's another way to finger press. You run it up and down your seams, and it flattens them out. We talked about grain, the lengthwise and crosswise threads in the ditch. So when you are piecing, and piecing is just sewing two pieces of fabric together, you will get a ditch. Here we go. That's not a good example. Oh, here we go. The red and the white will do. So when you sew the red and the white together, right here in this right here, this creates a seam. And some people are super sewers, and they can stitch in the ditch, and that hides the thread or the sewing on one side. You're just trying to hide it, but secure it. So that's stitching in the ditch. We talked about long arm quilting, matching points. This quilt should have a bunch of matching points. They don't. This was, I think, the third quilt that I've ever sewn. Don't judge me. I can do better now. But the points where, like right there is where they really overlap. Over there, they don't even touch. I cannot wait to redo this quilt one day because this quilt is stunning to me. It really speaks to my aesthetic, but the quality is, you know, somebody who's on their third quilt. But you want the points to match up. And so that's all that is, the matching points. Sometimes they should come to a perfect match, and I just don't see anything that is going to demonstrate that uber well. Ah, yes, I do. Let's try this quilt. Quilts are heavy. Okay, this is what they call a sampler quilt, which has a bunch of different blocks. So some patterns, everybody knows the name of them. And this one here is the card trick, my favorite, this green one here. And that's not a good example of matching points, this star. Okay, flying geese, here we go. That's something else that you will hear. I wasn't going to teach you today, but this shape right here, come on, work with me, not against me. This shape right here, the point, and this big triangle, that's called a flying geese. And you want this point to line up perfectly with that point so that it matches, so that they're matching up. And this one, I think, does a pretty good job of matching up your points. Pretty good. All right, on point. I was like, what? On point. And that's probably not something that you will encounter being a beginner, but card trick, my favorite quilt block of all time, is on point. Instead of the square being this way, where, there we go, that's how a square should look, just, you know, a square. It is diagonal, so it's rotated, it's on point. This is a square, and when you set them on point, bam, now it's at a diagonal angle, and you're gonna have to use some you're gonna have to use some triangles to get it to sit right and even. Regular square, on point. Corners are up. We talked about paper foundation piecing, and that is when you sew on the paper. And I'm in the middle of a huge paper pieced quilt, and I don't have not one close enough to me to grab. Okay. And we talked about piecing. That is taking one piece of fabric and sewing it to the other. So applique is when you take a shape and you sew it onto the fabric. Piecing is when you take the two and you sew them together. So you'll hear press this, press that, press this. Pressing and ironing are not the same thing. Let me tell you, I cannot iron, but I can press the heck out of something. So pressing is when you take the iron and you place it on your fabric, okay? You are not going back and forth. You are placing it down, lifting it up, placing it down, lifting it up. That is pressing. Do not be tempted to iron, because what'll happen is you'll start to distort your fabric, and then you have a super duper wonky quilt on accident. We talked about the quilt top. We talked about the quilting foot that has that 1/4 of an inch built in. 1/4 of an inch seams, it's all they talk about. 1/4 inch seam, 1/4 inch seam, 1/4 inch seam. In quilting, when you piece together your quilt, when you sew it together, you want to sew at a 1/4 of an inch. I am actually going to attempt to do that for you, just so you can see what the heck everybody is talking about. Let's grab these. It will show up. And I'm going to turn on my machine real quick, and I'll be right back with you with a 1/4 inch seam, hopefully. Fingers crossed. Before I do our 1/4 inch seam, I wanted to talk to you guys about something else they always say. I was like, what? Right sides together. You see this fabric? This is the right side of the fabric, which is the side of the fabric that you can really see the print on. This would be the wrong side of the fabric. A lot of the patterns and things that you will see will say stick right sides together. So I'm going to take this, and I'm going to take this, and I'm going to put them right sides together. And I'm just going to try to get them as close to each other as you can. Here's another hint that you just never would know, but you'll see people doing it. When you need to move your fabric just a hair up, down, use your nails to move it. It works. I don't care how short, long. You'll see a lot of people using their nails to inch their fabric for whatever reason. It works. Use your nails. So again, right sides together, and now I am going to sew this, hopefully at a 1/4 of an inch. Only God knows if that's going to work out, but we'll see. Okay, I am back. Let's look at these creative grids rulers really quickly. If you look up here at the top and the sides, you will see that there is a cloudy line, and that line there measures 1/4 inch. On this side, it is a 1/2 inch, okay? The cloudiness, that's all I'm talking about. So when they're asking that you sew a 1/4 inch seam really, why didn't I use red thread? This is just not smart. Can you see it? I doubt that you can, because I had the color thread that I had. Oh, I'll mark it. I'm going to use a pin so that we can darken it, because that's just a straight up fail. Okay, let's mark this here. Okay, because that just was a not smart moment. All right, can you see that brown line? Where is the brown line? These lights are super bright. Oh, right here. That brown line is 1/4 inch from the top. If I take this ruler and I place that there, you will see that that seam should be roughly 1/4 inch from the top, okay? That is 1/4 inch seam. As long as you're consistent, your quilts will be fine. I do not sew a consistent 1/4 inch seam. Sometimes it's a little bigger, sometimes it's not. You get better the more you do. But you want that. That is what they're talking about when they say 1/4 inch seam. Then they're going to tell you to press it a direction. They're going to say press it to the right, press it to the left. So this is your seam. And when they say press it to the direction, you're either going to press them to the left or press it to the right, or you can press it open. Because the object of the game is to get your quilt as flat as it can be within reason. I mean, you're going to feel it. You're going to feel some bumps here and there, but you want to try to get it flat so that when you're going through the whole quilt sandwich, your needle is not running into a bunch of stuff. You want it to be smooth as possible. So this is your seam. You might be asked to press it to the left, press it to the right, press it open, and then I'm going to sew another one of these and show you guys what nesting is, because I was like, what the heck is everybody? Nest your seams, nest your seams. How? What does that even mean? So we're going to sew another one, right sides together. I've just sewn another one. They say, oh, nest your seams. How is somebody supposed to know what that means? So I have a seam here and a seam there. Right sides, right? So we're going to put right sides together. Okay, and now you see both of my seams, like right there. One is that, I mean, they're both just up, right? When they nest, one is going to the right and one is going to the left. And then that makes it feel flat. You can feel it with your fingers, but you really want them to nest, because then they will line up perfectly, and then you will have your, well, you could quilt block, but then you've sewn it together and then you have a bigger block. But that's what nesting means. One seam is going one way, one seam is going the other way. And a great way to keep them like that is to use your pin. If I had like 10 of these sewn together, 10 of these sewn together, then I had 10 of these sewn together, I would go through at each intersection and I would pin it so that one lays one way and one lays the other. Before I pin it, I iron it one way. So I'll iron it to the left or to the right, and then I'll iron it back the other ones the opposite direction. Then when you lay them all together, it helps to make your quilt lay as flat as possible. So that's the goal with that. And so we would just take these and nest them, and then I would sew down this side and then open it up, and all of these points should be coming together, and that would be matching points. We talked about a sandwich. We talked about the sampler quilt, which is just a bunch of different quilt blocks that have names that are all together. This one has a flying geese block. That one has a log. That's not a log cabin. Yes, it is. Here's a log cabin over here. The blue is the log cabin. The red is the rail fence. This is probably one of my favorite quilts. My first quilt was huge because it didn't dawn on me you didn't have to make the world's largest quilts. Quilts don't always have to go on beds. That's something that I didn't know. I didn't know that there were art quilts and small quilts. You can make a mug rug, which is basically just a little itty bitty quilt that you could put your mug on and your donut. Obsessed. Totally want to make tons of those. Sashing. Sashing is an important one. Do I have a quilt with sashing in it? Jeez, I don't. Nope. We talked about a border. So the border is what goes around your quilt. Sashing is when you take a strip and you put it in between your quilt blocks. That's sashing, okay? And then the cornerstone would be if I put like a square right here, and then it was a sash right there, and then another square, cornerstones and sashing. I am going to be sashing the heck out of my Disney quilt. So each quilt block will be separated by a strip of white fabric. Sashing. Scrap quilt. Don't throw out your quilt. It's just a quilt made of scraps, usually patchwork of a bunch of different fabrics. We talked about the selvage. Swaps. You'll hear people say swap. What that means is I make a mug rug, you make a mug rug, we switch. Yours is now mine, mine is now yours. We have swapped, or we've entered into a huge swap where we're doing it with like 6 people. Totally want to do a mug rug swap now. Templates. Rulers can be templates. Oh, here's a template. Go me. I cut this with my Cricut. It is a big circle. I don't know what I was using it for, but I needed it. And, oh, I think I took some fabric, and yes, I do know what I was, anyway. This is a template. Comes in all different shapes. Some are made out of acrylic or rulers. Some are made out of freezer paper. You can make a template out of anything that you need, but this is a template. All right, guys, those are my beginner quilt terms for you. If you have questions, please leave them below. I have not been quilting long, but I wanted to kind of take you through this journey with me. I've just been getting so many questions about where I started and why I started there, because I put a lot of effort into my personal curriculum of learning quilting. And so I would love to tell you guys which quilts I did, what number I did, why I tried it, and what the results were. And maybe it's something that you guys might want to try, because if I can do it, you can certainly do it. All right, until next time.